Hey everybody, it's Grandmaster Ben Finegold here. We have some technical issues. Hopefully this video will make it to the internets. It'll be a miracle. So it could be that we're the only people who will ever see this video. We want to thank our sponsor, Robert, because that's our sponsor. And his last name is anonymous, which is, a lot of people have that last name. Today's lecture is called Secrets of the Sicilian. Unlike previous lectures where I have pictures and information and games, I got nothing. It's all in here, okay? It's sort of like Kramer, except, maybe I'll remember some stuff. And so forth. So we're gonna talk about not from anybody's point of view. We're gonna talk about from everybody's point of view. Okay, so the Sicilian starts with E4, C5, and it doesn't have to start with E4, C5 because any opening you can have transpositions. So if a game is a Sicilian, it's probably at least 95% that this was the first move for each side, but it's not 100% because these moves could be played later and it transposes to a Sicilian, but that's neither here nor there. Now, this is an issue that I've talked about quite a bit with my students, but it seems to go above their head for the most part. And I decided to make this lecture very simple. This will be my simplest lecture ever. So if you don't know the rules of chess, you should still be okay. Okay, which is probably about half of you. All right, so in the Sicilian, you have to understand why you're playing certain moves. And what a lot of people do when they learn an opening, they close their eyes and they make the same 5, 10 moves they make every game, but they don't know why they're doing it. That's just what they always do. So this lecture is going to explain why you're making the moves so that when you have a similar position or even the same in your own game, you'll actually know why you're making the move instead of, I always make this move, I don't know. Now, the purpose of the Sicilian defense from the black side, well, I should say, is to confuse itself with the Queen's Gambit for the mini-series, but I won't talk about that, is to stop white from playing d4 on move 2. And if we go back a move, if white could move again, and super grandmasters were white, they would play d4 here. And the two most common openings, the idea is to prevent d4. That would be c5, the Sicilian, and e5. And if black plays any other move on move 1, such as e6, d6, c6, then 95% of the time, grandmasters play d4. So c5 says if you play d4, I'm going to take it. Now, this is the most important thing in the Sicilian, is you understand why you're playing the Sicilian. You're playing the Sicilian with black because you're trying to prevent white from playing d4. And if white does play d4, then you take the d4 pawn. If you don't take the d4 pawn, then why did you play the Sicilian? He plays d4 and you're ignoring it. So in this position, for example, if white played d4, then you would take it. If you don't take it, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, so at the grandmaster level, I have to make up some percentage. 85% or more play the move knight f3. And the reason is you're developing your knight, and if you are going to play d4, which is called the open Sicilian, you're going to capture with the knight instead of moving your queen, because you don't want to move your queen in the opening. You can move your queen, but I'm telling you the reason why they play knight f3. Now, everybody's favorite grandmaster, Bent Larsen, who was very active in the 60s and 70s, and he died several years ago, he said it's a crime for white to play the open Sicilian because you shouldn't give up a center pawn for a side pawn. Okay, very, very suspicious understanding of chess. But that's what almost every grandmaster does, because that gives white the best chance of getting an advantage, is to play d4, and both of the bishops and both of the knights can get out for white, and black has a lot of trouble developing his pieces. And black usually gets a solid passive position, and white plays very aggressively. Unfortunately for white, he has to give up a center pawn for the Sicilian C pawn to do it. Now, you don't have to play the open Sicilian with white, but most people do. And if you have the black pieces and you play the Sicilian a lot, most people play one of three moves here: knight c6, d6, or e6. And occasionally, you'll see g6 or a6. Occasionally. And I mean, basically, everybody was playing the open Sicilian, and then people started to play what are called anti-Sicilians. So a lot of people were playing bishop b5 on move 3 instead of playing d4. And against e6, Fischer, for example, liked to play the King's Indian attack because he thought this was a poor move against the King's Indian attack, which is d3, knight bd2, g3, bishop g2, castles. So you don't have to play the open Sicilian. And Fischer, when he faced knight c6 and d6, would play the open Sicilian, but against e6, half the time he would play d3 and play the King's Indian attack, and Fischer has a lot of famous games against that. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% sure why Fischer thinks the King's Indian attack is really good against e6, but not as good against d6 or knight c6. I mean, obviously, black can't play e5 without losing a tempo, and white's ready to play e5 if black plays d5. So that's one thing going for it. Okay, now the open Sicilian, which is the most common, and I'll play a random move for black, that's the most common, is d4 takes, knight takes. And in any Sicilian that's the open Sicilian, the most important thing that can happen in the opening is asking yourself, can I play knight f6 and I've prevented e5? If you play knight f6 and they play e5 and you move your knight away, that's bad. But if e5 is a bad move, then you could play knight f6. So you're worried about e5 when you're black, and if they can't play e5, then you're good. And you want to play knight f6 here, because if you don't, white has the chance to play c4 and then knight c3, the so-called Marazzi bind, and gets a space advantage, and it's hard for black to break out. However, if black plays the common knight f6, 97% of grandmaster games, white plays knight c3, and you can't move the c pawn now, it's blocked. And in this position, the two most common moves are the knight Orff a6 and the dragon with g6. And another popular move is knight c6, and in fact, this is a position I have a lot with black, but I play a different move order, and we're actually going to talk about move orders and why certain grandmasters play certain move orders. Okay, and after the move d6, white can also play bishop b5 check. And after the move knight c6, white could also play bishop b5 instead of the open Sicilian. And so if you have the black pieces, you have to ask yourself, do I prefer this position with black, or do I prefer this position with black? If your intention is to put both knights out anyway, because that's the main way that white would not do that. If white plays the open Sicilian anyway, which is this, you could get this position by playing d6 first, or you could play knight c6 first to get this position. The only thing you're worried about is white playing bishop b5. I am in the minority of grandmasters not a huge minority, but an obvious minority, that doesn't mind bishop b5 here. I actually like having black here. And I don't know anything about bishop b5 here. Most grandmasters are the other way around. They like to have black here, but against knight c6, they're more uncomfortable. Now, there's a grandmaster some of you have heard of, I hope, named Eugene Perelstein, and he's an American grandmaster, and he's one of the world's leading authorities on the accelerated dragon, where the move order that I play is knight c6, d4, takes, g6. This is the normal main way you play an accelerated dragon with black. And I don't play the accelerated dragon every time I play the Sicilian. I used to. Now I probably play it like a third of the time, and the other 2/3 I play some other variation. Now, some grandmasters don't like to face bishop b5 here. So Eugene Perelstein recommends, if you want to play the accelerated dragon but don't want to face bishop b5, he plays g6 on move 2. And now, if it goes the same way, we can get the accelerated dragon position, but there was no bishop b5. Okay, and so if you play g6 here, you have to learn other things that white can do that he can't do against knight c6. The main one is queen takes d4, which obviously you can't play when there's a knight on c6. And Eugene thinks this is fine for black, but you need to know the theory. You can't just be like, okay, now what do I do? Now, the biggest problem with a lot of class players and even some masters is they play an opening, but there's a sideline or there's a variation they don't know. That variation happens. Their opponent knows all kinds of theory, and they're like, uh-oh, I know 20 variations, but this is one I don't know. And then they sit there confused and they play badly. And if that happens to you, that's actually okay. I actually don't mind when that happens. When my opponent plays something I don't know, which is my fault, okay, then we play the game. Maybe I lose, maybe I don't. Then when the game is over, I can analyze that variation to the teeth. I have a game, I can analyze it with an engine or with ChessBase or whatever I use, and then the next time I'll know it. And sometimes you have to learn just by trial and error. You can't memorize every single variation. You can't do it. So if you've played the Sicilian for 10 years, you've seen a lot of different stuff. If you've played the Sicilian for 10 days, there's just a lot of things you don't know because you don't have the experience. So obviously it's unfortunate that you have to get some of that experience without learning it first, but that's actually what you should do. It's very difficult to memorize everything and it never happened to you. It's much easier when it's happened to you, right? You're like, oh, I lost to this guy and I beat this guy. And even if you lost, it doesn't necessarily mean it was the result of the opening. And just to tell you what the main line is, it's knight f6, e5, knight here. The queen goes to either this square or this square. I'm not super familiar. And then I think they play queen e4. And then I don't, I'm not, the knight goes here or here, I don't know. Okay, and then Perelstein told me he thinks this is fine for black. And so if this is fine for black, and he doesn't like bishop e5 on move 3, then he's going to play g6 on move 2. And so that's what Perelstein does. And that's a move order in the accelerated dragon, which avoids bishop b5. Okay, and if you want to play knight c6, because you're playing some variation of the Sicilian, you have to know bishop b5 a lot more now than you did 30, 40, 50 years ago. I almost want to say, I don't want to say it, I almost want to say bishop b5 might be more popular than d4. Man. If I had said that 30 years ago, they would have taken my titles away. Now it might be true. And so if you have black in a Sicilian and you decide to play some variation, the dragon, the Najdorf, whatever, and you have to know what the sidelines are with the move order that you play. And I'll give you a really interesting example. The Scheveningen, as us Americans say, was very popular. Okay, this was super popular in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Okay, this position. And for about 15, 20 years, people played the Keres attack, named after the Estonian grandmaster, and white had really good results. I'm not saying it's good for white, I'm saying white did really well. Probably it's good for white. And white's going to play g5 and so forth. And some boring players, they didn't want to play g4, so they played bishop e2, or they played h3, or they played a4. They played something that was innocuous. And a lot of people wanted to play the Scheveningen, but they didn't want to face the Keres attack. So in the 80s, it became very popular to pretend to play the Najdorf, a6. Now, Najdorf was named after your favorite grandmaster, Miguel Najdorf. And Najdorf played the Najdorf because he wanted to play the move e5. And the problem with e5 right now is I have bishop b5 check. And again, if you're rated 1,000, 1,200, 1,400, 1,600, 1,800, these are the kind of things you don't know. You just you opened a book on the Najdorf and said, okay, I'll play that. That's sort of the purpose of this lecture, is to tell you why you're playing these moves. The problem with e5 is after bishop b5 check, white has easy access to these squares for his knights, and black doesn't want to trade the white squared bishops, but even if he blocks with the knight here, this knight can go to f5. So e5 is considered somewhat suspicious, but some GMs still play it like as a surprise. Surprise, but I don't think it's a good surprise. All right, so after a6, no matter what move white plays, bishop e2, bishop e3, we can play the Najdorf with e5, or f4, or f3. But people who want to play the Scheveningen but wanted to avoid the Keres attack, they're just pretending to play the Najdorf. You can't play g4 now because it's hanging. There's no pawn on e6 blocking the bishop. So if white thinks, oh, it's a Najdorf, in the Najdorf, I play bishop e2, they play e5, I go here, and I know 700 moves of theory. Okay, well, a lot of people in the 80s and 90s, they started playing a6 so they could play the Scheveningen, and white's already played bishop e2. Now g4 is not as scary, because in a lot of Keres attacks, the bishop comes out to here or here. Bishop e2 is sort of meek. It's just a castle. It's not super aggressive move. And so this became quite common to play the Scheveningen but avoid the Keres attack. So you play a6 first, then you play e6 when, if they make a move that, makes g4 less strong for white. And that's very common nowadays. And a lot of people are still playing the Najdorf way, the way that Najdorf intended, but some of them aren't. And obviously, you can also play the dragon, which is also very common. And these openings have been played by all kinds of grandmasters. Grandmasters all the time play this. And this is a discussion that doesn't really have an answer. I'll give you my opinion. Your opinion could be different. Doesn't mean that you're right or I'm right. We're probably both wrong. If you play the most common openings that have the stamp of approval from all the top players, you run the risk of your opponent knowing it better than you. If you play your own stuff that's not very common, but you play it a lot, then you're going to know it better than your opponent. If you play the most common moves that have been played in thousands of Grandmaster games, you're going to have a memory contest with your opponent. So if you're like a lazy, not studying too much chess kind of person because you have a family and a job, ridiculous, or something else, and you don't have time to study openings as much as certain other people do, you might not want to play openings that are known for having 20 moves of theory because you don't have the time to look at it. But if you're the kind of guy who says, I'm going to learn this opening that all the grandmasters play, and I'm going to know it just like they do. If Anish Giri and Magnus Carlsen come up to me, I can have an interesting discussion about the dragon because I know it as well as they do. I studied this game, I studied that game, I studied this game. Or you can be like, this is the dragon, that's all I know. Now, I don't recommend playing really sharp, complicated Sicilians when your theoretical knowledge ends on move 4. I don't recommend that. So if you play the dragon or the knight orf, and then your opponent makes a move on move 5 or 6, and you're like, okay, I'm on my own, that's a very risky, venture. So if you're going to do a lot of serious study, then you should play the openings that grandmasters all like. If you know it as well as they do, you play the first 10, 15 moves like a grandmaster. Now, in the dragon, not only can white play the Yugoslav attack, which is bishop e3 and f3, and white plays queen d2 and castles queenside. Sometimes white plays bishop c4 first. Sometimes white plays g4. Sometimes white plays h4. Sometimes white plays both. And a lot of people that have black in a dragon, they try to make up their own way of playing that isn't the most common, so their opponent doesn't have 25 moves prepared. And some people with white do that too. And another way to play for white is to not castle queenside and play for mate, but just, castle kingside and just play a positional way where nobody's getting checkmated and, your white's trying to prove he has a better position because he has more space. It's not easy to put this bishop anywhere. The knight's good in the center. And what a lot of people do is they take shortcuts, is they study an opening, they get to move 5, 6, or 7, their engine says it's equal or somebody slightly better, and they're like, all right, that's enough, I'm done. And if you do that and the opening is very unusual, I think that's fine because your opponent's sitting there confused like you. But if you're going to play open Sicilians and play knight orfs and dragons, and you're like, yeah, I don't know anything past move 5, that's a recipe for disaster. Okay, and I'll give you an example from my own games. I play knight c6 when I'm black, okay, and I usually face the open Sicilian. And in this position, all the super grandmasters are playing the Sveshnikov now with e5, which I've never played. I play d6. Now, when I'm playing on my stream, and if you watch my stream, or you've seen my games, I have black in this position all the time. I had it 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. I probably had it 20 times last week in blitz chess. And when my opponents are very low rated, they're rated, 500, 800, 1100, 1400. They're out of their prep. This is it. That's all they know. That's it. And, if I'm playing a grandmaster and I am, we go to move 12 or 13 before one of us starts saying, okay, now what? And a common move that's played by low-rated players is this move, which is just a generic move, like move my bishop out. And the first secret in the secrets of the Sicilian lecture that I'm giving, like an important secret, is when you have the white pieces, don't let your opponent play knight g4 and it's good. And it's sort of like when you have the black pieces and you play knight f6, if e5 is good, then don't play knight f6. And I want to go back because I forgot to tell you, in this position where I play knight f6, you can't play e5 because, guy takes it. And if you want to play knight takes and e5, black has a trick here. if black didn't have this trick, then grandmasters would play knight takes at e5. And, you know, if you're a low-rated player, even if you've memorized an opening book, better than I could ever do, well, this isn't given in the opening book because it's bad. Nobody plays this with white. So if some low-rated player played this against you and you had the black pieces, you would say, well, this isn't theory. What's this all about? And you might play knight d5, after which I would take the white pieces. Okay? And obviously what you should do, which some of you have already seen, is queen a5 check, and that wins the pawn on e5. That's why grandmasters don't do this. Now, after knight c3, if it was white's turn to move here, and it's not, and if any grandmaster would play knight takes and then e5, and black has to go back to g8. Ugh, terrible. And so the book moves here are d6, e6, and e5. And by the way, after e6, one of the main lines is take, e5, knight d5. This is considered better for white. But this is what white would do if black did that. Okay, and I play d6, so I put the kibosh on e5. Now, if I'm playing somebody very strong, it's 90% they'll play bishop c4 or bishop g5. Those are the most common moves. If I play a very low-rated player and they're like, okay, that's all I know, I'm out, they'll play like random legal move, maybe here, and that allows the aforementioned knight g4. And occasionally, even against higher-rated players, 1900, 2000, 2100, in a blitz game, they fail here and they get a losing position immediately. And many times in my life, in blitz chess and bullet chess, I've done this with black, and they either play knight b3 or knight takes knight, and then I checkmate them. And then usually I win because, you know, checkmate. Obviously, moving the knight is ridiculous. And after knight g4, theory says black is fine. Grandmasters don't play bishop e3. Now, I don't want to confuse you too much. In the Najdorf Sicilian, which is different. Okay, so the position's exactly the same, except it's not. The difference is a6 was played instead of knight c6. That's the difference. In this position, tons of grandmasters play bishop e3, a move that I said no grandmasters play if the black knight is on c6. And the reason is there's no pressure on this knight after knight g4, bishop g5. This position has been seen in thousands of grandmaster games. But this knight's defended and it's not attacked. If there was a black knight on c6, then queen b6 is very strong, attacking two things. Now queen b6 isn't strong at all, and there's a lot of grandmaster games in this position. But bishop e3 in one position is reasonable, but it's not reasonable in another position because of knight g4. If knight g4 is strong and it puts you in a lot of trouble, then now you know why in the Dragon Sicilian, for example, after bishop e3, black cannot play knight g4. That move actually loses immediately. Can somebody unmute themselves and tell me the winning move for white? White to play and win. If anybody's talking, I can't hear them. Nothing? Somebody give the wrong answer. I don't care. Is anybody saying anything? Anyone?
Someone said bishop e5 or b5 check, I assume. That doesn't seem right.
That's correct. I'm not even sure where that sound came from. All right. Right, bishop b5 check is winning for white because the knight here is not protected sufficiently. If you put something on d7, the knight is hanging. For example, bishop d7, chop, 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 chop. If it's free, it's for me. Okay, so nobody plays knight g4 because it loses. They play bishop g7. Now, if it was black's turn to move, knight g4 is possible because after bishop e5 check, we could play king f8. It's possible. So if you play like queen d2, which is a bad move, now knight g4 is really good. Bishop b5 does nothing because the queen's not on the knight. So I can put anything I want on d7. And in any Sicilian on the internet, when I'm playing blitz chess and my opponents are lower rated than I am, and they let me play knight g4 when it's good, it's very common they give me their bishop on e3. If black plays knight here, knight takes bishop, that's very bad for white. It's two bishops, all the dark squares, there's no attack for white. And so every grandmaster plays f3. That's why I don't have white in the Sicilian, never play f3. Then they can play queen d2 at their leisure. But the point isn't that you should know exact move orders. The point is, I mean, you should, but that's not the point. The point is, you should know what moves are dangerous. And in a Sicilian, when you have black, e5 is dangerous. If your opponent plays e5 and you go, oh, I didn't see that, you can't not see that. That's the move you have to see. And if you have the white pieces and your opponent plays knight g4 and you're like, oh, I didn't see that, you got to see that. That's what you got to see. That's the moves you're worried about. And sometimes your opponent can make those moves, but you're not so worried. You're like, it's okay. Okay, I saw knight g4, wasn't worried about it. I saw e5, no problem. And, sometimes you're wrong, but usually you're right. You figured out what's going on. And at the grandmaster level, currently, the knight orf is very common for black. And also common, I guess more recently, is the Sveshnikov, and they usually play this move order. You could play more than one move order. So Magnus, for example, likes to have black in this position. He has many times. Many other grandmasters have as well. And it's very complicated. And I could have said this like the first thing in the lecture. The reason I'm not saying it's their reason, but it should be their reason. The reason you should play the Sicilian is that you want an interesting game. You don't want a boring game where you're fighting for equality. That's not what you want. You want an interesting game that has very few draws and is very combative. And usually when white plays e4 and black plays c5, as we see here, they both want a combative game. They don't want to draw, they want to win, they want a game that's very interesting. And sometimes, at the top level, when it's e4, e5, sometimes it's not very interesting. Sometimes they trade everything off and agree to a draw pretty quickly. And in the Sicilian, that's a much more rare event. And when you're playing in a match and you're in a must-win situation with black, it's very common to play the Sicilian. And world champions who were considered very combative and didn't draw very much, like Fischer and Kasparov, they played the Sicilian. Some world champions are considered less interesting, and maybe they played the Caro-Kann or e4, e5 with black, maybe. Now, in every opening where white plays e4, if he wants to play d4 but doesn't want to take with a piece, he wants to take with a pawn, keep that pawn on d4, he plays c3. Okay, and if you have the black pieces, many people could play c3 against you, and there's several different ways to play for black, and you have to decide which one you like. Do you like playing e6 and d5, possibly transposing to an advanced French? Do you like playing d5 and taking with the queen? Do you like playing knight f6 and then playing knight d5 here? And you have to decide what fits your, like what you happen to like. And there's a very funny quote from Sveshnikov, who was the world's leading authority and the most likely player to play c3 on move 2. Sveshnikov said, it's very unfortunate that as a child, when you're learning chess, if you learn chess as a child, and then you later became a grandmaster, a lot of times the openings you learned as a child, that's what you've played your whole life, so you played as a grandmaster. And he said, it's just total luck that some people learn d5 here and some people learn knight f6. And then he said, obviously, knight f6 is better. That was his opinion. And so he felt bad for grandmasters who learned this early on in their chess career because they had to play that inferior move, okay, which is the move that I play. So, and he was very adamant that this is the way for black to get a good position, and he thought white had an advantage after d5 takes, queen takes. I mean, it's a little silly, but okay. And you can also, of course, play e6 and d5. Now, here's what I do. When I have white in a Sicilian, which is rare, I try to confuse my opponent. And if I play knight f3, they think it's going to be an open Sicilian, so they play their open Sicilian move, which is usually one of these three moves. And let's say, for example, I'll give you an example so you see where I'm coming from. Let's say you always play knight f6, and you always get this position with black. That's your bread and butter, that's what you learned, and you're very happy with it. Okay, and then after knight f3, you play the Sveshnikov. No, you play the dragon. So you play here, you're going to play a dragon Sicilian, and now your opponent plays here. And you're like, wait, what? That's not the dragon Sicilian, that's the c3 Sicilian with these two moves thrown in. And this is devastating if you don't know it, especially if you play d5 on move 2. So, which, by the way, I do. So in this position, if you always play d5, which I do, and then you always play the dragon, and the guy goes here, you've been tricked, unless you already know about this, and you have to have something ready. You have to be ready for the c3 Sicilian on move 2 and on move 3. And I talked to a couple of grandmaster friends of mine before you guys were born, and I tried to ask them, I said, is there a negative for white playing the c3 Sicilian, but playing here first? And they were like, a negative, knight on f3, what's wrong with that? I'm not playing f4 later, I don't do that. So knight f3, c3 often tricks my opponents to play a move order they don't understand. And so, for example, Boris Gelfand, who's one of the best prepared players ever, he was tricked because against the closed Sicilian, which goes like this, okay, this is what Gelfand does with black, and this is what most grandmasters do with black against the closed Sicilian. And when he was black in an open Sicilian, he played the knight orf. That's Gelfand. Go Gelfand. The only chess player on earth you've heard of that's older than me. Okay, and many years ago, somebody played this against Gelfand, and he played here, waiting for the Sicilian, and his opponent played here, and he made some move, I don't know, and then here. And then he's like, wait, I don't play this. This isn't my opening. Or maybe he played even g6, waiting for this kind of close Sicilian. And then after g6, the guy played here. And this is an accelerated dragon. Gelfand doesn't play the accelerated dragon. So sometimes if white plays a flexible move order, black has to be flexible too. And black has to realize you can't always play the opening you want if the guy plays a move order you don't understand. I mean, that's not going to happen. And I'll show you something really funny, actually. One of my former students, Talia Cervantes, we worked together for like 2 years, and she's like 2,300 something. And she lives in St. Louis. And after E4, she started playing E5. And she wasn't playing that normally. That was like a new thing for her. And I played her in Foxwoods 2 years ago. And I was like, oh yeah, she plays E5 now. I don't really play E4 very much, but I was going to play something weird against her Sicilian. Then it occurred to me I could play here. And this is how our game went. And the reason I did this is a line in the English opening that I knew when I was a kid that she's never seen before. So I tricked her into playing black in an English opening where I knew lots of theory and she didn't. Although I was worse after the opening and then I won anyway. And that has to do with getting positions you're familiar with that your opponent is not. By having your pet variations, you can often get an opening advantage. And one move that was a favorite of the Estonian Grandmaster Paul Keres again, is knight e2. And now, is white going to play knight here, g3, bishop g2? Or is white going to play d4? Well, you don't know. So you have to be ready for these moves. Otherwise, if you play the Najdorf Sicilian, you might play here thinking, okay, now we're gonna play a Najdorf Sicilian. Okay, or a dragon. And then your opponent plays this, and you're like, well, if I play the Najdorf, I can't go here, so I hope he goes d4, and then he plays here. And you're like, I don't play this with black, what is this? It's just a closed Sicilian where you've been tricked into playing stuff you don't play. And if you have the white pieces and you play a flexible move like knight e2, where the guy doesn't know if you're going to play d4 or g3, sometimes you can get people where they're totally confused. And a lot of people who want to play f4 in the Sicilian, they preface it with knight c3 because most grandmasters think d5 is a good response here. And if you take, white center's basically collapsed. So they play knight c3 first, and then they play f4 for people who play that way. And there's something called the Grand Prix attack, which starts this way, so named because on the British Grand Prix Tour, this was a very common opening in the 80s and 90s. At the top level, not so common. It doesn't matter much for the typical player what the super grandmasters do. I try to avoid what they do because I think that's the most likely thing my opponent will know. I think if Carlsen plays Kramnik and the game is analyzed by every grandmaster in the world, if I play one side of that, it's likely, no matter who I'm playing, they've seen that. But if I play something nobody knows that I've played a lot, which I do, then my opponents are more confused. And everything theoretically should lead to a draw, so nothing that doesn't lose material for anything should be bad. You might not be fighting for the advantage. You're fighting for a position that you like that your opponent doesn't. And so if you're black in a Sicilian and you're like, I play the Najdorf or I play the dragon or whatever, that's like 20% of being ready for the Sicilian, because your opponent doesn't have to let you play the dragon or let you play the Najdorf or whatever variation you play. They can play c3 early, they can play f4 early, they can play queen takes d4 instead of knight takes, which I've also done. Bishop b5 is a very common move. And so you have to know anti-Sicilians when you play the Sicilian as black. And when you have white, obviously if you play e4, you got to know everything, the French, the Carol, everything. So the Sicilian, normally people don't have the luxury of studying chess 12 hours a day. So they don't have like 3 or 4 different variations they play. They have like 1 or 2. They're like, okay, Sicilian, this is what I do. Caro-Kann, this is what I do. French, this is what I do. You can't just, be like Ivanchuk and just play everything and know everything, because that's hard to do. And what do I recommend? I recommend doing something you like where you don't have to learn 20 different things. And the riskiest thing you can do to make it likely you'll get confused is to just play any open Sicilian. Then you're going to have to do a lot of work because your opponent could play basically 7 or 8 different variations. Typically, if you're white in an open Sicilian, your opponent's playing what they play. If they play the Najdorf, that means they play the Najdorf. If they play the dragon, that means they play the dragon. So if you have to learn all these different lines with white and your opponent's only learning one, that makes it tougher for you. It's not impossible, but that's why a lot of people are playing bishop b5 after either d6 or knight c6, because now their opponent can't play any of the open Sicilians and they just learn bishop b5. Or like me, they play c3. And occasionally I'll even play queen takes d4, and I have some tricky lines that I've memorized in this line. I don't play e4 that often, but if I do play e4, I don't want to run into 25 moves of theory and my opponent's moving instantly. That's not for me. And the thing to learn about the Sicilian, it's such a common opening that it's very likely your opponent has a lot of knowledge. So if you go into a very well-known line, but you don't know it very well, that's very risky. You gotta know what you're doing in the more common lines. If you play side lines that you like the wing attack or b3, or even knight a3 was played for a while. Get that knight to c4 later. You can play what you want. And if you study it, you'll know it better than your opponent. And when you have the black pieces, you have to be ready for everything. You can't be shocked. You have to be like, okay, the guy played the wing gambit. That's what a lot of class players do. Sometimes they play the delayed wing gambit, which is even stranger. And the idea is if you take with the knight, you can build a big center. Bam! For the b pawn, which doesn't matter very much. Well, it's a pawn. So when you think you know everything about the Sicilian, the variations you play, it's almost impossible to stop your opponent from playing a sideline that they know. So obviously, at the top level of chess, these guys all know each other and they study each other's games. So if Carlsen starts playing knight a3 on move 2, you can't just not know that. You gotta be like, oh yeah, 2 months ago Carlsen played knight a3, 5 months ago he played knight a3, but I'm not gonna look at that. You gotta look at that. Okay, if super GMs are doing things that are unusual, you gotta be ready for them, and those guys work all day and all night making sure they don't lose out of the opening and they know what they're doing. And the Sicilian has a lot of interesting ideas that you can come up with on your own. You don't have to play the open Sicilian Najdorf line that your favorite player plays. You can play anything you want. And I remember a guy, I think he was from Ohio, when he played the closed Sicilian, like knight c3 and g3, he didn't play knight c3. He would play d3, then he'd play knight d2, then he'd play c3, and then f4, knight here. Sometimes he'd play bishop e2, sometimes he'd Finegold. And his opponents weren't booked up on that. They, d3, who's looking at d3? So he was getting the same kinds of positions over and over again that he liked, and his opponents were in new territory. And the best thing you can do in any opening is come up with things that you like. If you're like, well, Kasparov did this 25 years ago, and he beat this Portish, and I memorized that game, now I'm going to show everybody. That's probably not going to happen, right? Probably there's more theory since then. Your opponent's not going to play 20 moves of theory. But if you have your own variations that are often just as good as the main lines have your pet variations. The problem with a lot of class players today is their pet variations sacrifice all their pieces. I'm like, why'd you give up your knight? Oh yeah, I do that all the time. You can have your own variation, which almost nobody plays, that you play all the time, that doesn't lose material. It's not necessary to lose material to make it your own variation, although it does make it more likely, because other people don't want to lose material. And I'll end with something sort of funny, I guess. About 40 years ago, 50 years ago, international master Danny Kopek, who also died a few years ago, he invented the Kopek system, bishop d3, confusing the audience. Okay, and he wanted to play castles, c3, bishop c2, d4. That's what he did. And people are like, bishop d3, what's that? And he's like, that's the Kopek system, I'm Kopek. Okay? And, he made up his own thing. And it's reasonable. I mean, I could play reasonable moves for both sides. I'm a reasonable kind of guy. E6, here, all right. And white's position looks okay. And the idea is the bishop's protecting this pawn. If it was on e2 or c4, it wouldn't be doing that. And in a lot of Ruy Lopez's, we see bishop here, bishop here, bishop here. So it's not so crazy. But he invented his own thing. And he's like, bishop d3, nobody knows that. So you can play offbeat stuff that maybe somebody else invented, or you can invent your own offbeat stuff, or you can study the Sicilian for hours and hours and hours, study it more than your opponent, and beat them out of the opening because you know more theory than they do. That's not what I do, but you could do that if you want. It takes a lot of work to play the opening correctly, and if you decide, the Sicilian, that's a popular opening, I'll play that. And that's your preparation? I mean, the preparation is hours and hours of study of these variations, so you know what you're doing. That's why playing your own variation with white or black is what I recommend, because you'll be familiar with it and your opponent probably won't. And don't do things that are intentionally bad, just do things that you like. It's a very difficult opening, and that's why all the world champions were playing it, because they want to win. They want to set problems for their opponents. They study chess all the time. They have great preparation. And occasionally, a super grandmaster gets crushed in the Sicilian because it's so complicated. His opponent out-prepared him. Well, that's the Sicilian, and I usually have black, but sometimes I have white, especially on my stream. It's much more likely it's a blitz game if I have white. I mean, when I was a kid, I played d4. It's not my fault. Sheshnikov was right. So thanks for watching today. And this is, again, Grandmaster Ben Finegold here at the Chess Club and Scholastic Center of Atlanta. Please like and subscribe. And also, let's once again thank our generous donor, sponsor, Robert. You're the best until the next guy donates. See you next time. Bye.